to say Social Security is a Ponzi scheme doesn't mean the people currently getting Social Security checks are a bunch of criminals or something. No, in a standard Ponzi scheme, the people running it are the criminals, right? The people participating are dupes or victims, okay? And so here, it's extra not their fault because at least in a regular private sector Ponzi scheme like Bernie Madoff's victims, especially over time, they probably should have known better. But when it comes to Social Security, even though lots of us have known for a long time now that, yeah, this is unsustainable, we can't just opt out, right? So it's not that we fell for the confidence man's clever ploy and rhetorical techniques. It's no, the government said you are going to participate in this retirement scheme or else you will go to jail.
Welcome to InFi, the future of finance.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the InFi podcast. Today I'm going to continue the streak of discussing Elon Musk tweets because they're interesting and they're such provocative things that they spawn all sorts of conversations. So in particular, I'm going to cover two more in this episode. Last time, you remember, we discussed Social Security, and that was on the heels of Elon tweeting out a table showing all the age distributions of people that apparently are still in the Social Security database as being listed alive, and some of them are more than 200 years old. So that's what we talked about last time. This time, there is a clip of Elon Musk calling Social Security a Ponzi scheme. And so as you can imagine, a lot of Elon's critics didn't care for that. And then also because the Atlanta Fed updated its recession forecast, presumably in part because of Doge's spending cuts or recommended spending cuts, so we'll see if they happen or not. Elon then tweeted out something about how it's silly that we include government spending in our GDP calculations, and that, again, spawned a whole conversation as well. And so let me just mention, I have had people say to me, because I'm in the trenches on this stuff on social media myself, and I have had people say, hey, why don't you go ahead and do a podcast episode on this and really spell it out because this is good stuff. So I'm here to please. I'm a man of the people. Okay, so as far as the Ponzi scheme stuff, why don't we just, in case you missed it, we'll go ahead and play the context here.
Well, I mean, the government's one big pyramid scheme, if you ask me.
Yeah, well, you can tell me better than anybody.
Social Security is the biggest Ponzi scheme of all time.
Right, explain that.
Well, people pay into Social Security, and the money goes out of Social Security immediately, but the obligation for Social Security is your entire retirement career.
Okay, so as you can imagine, lots of people were losing their minds over that, tweeting things, well, certainly a lot of Democratic lawmakers, but other pundits who are anti-MAGA, things along the lines of, oh, wow, the world's richest man can't stand it to know the widows are getting checks from the government so they can go buy tuna fish. He just wants even more, that kind of stuff. And so to be clear, to say Social Security is a Ponzi scheme doesn't mean the people currently getting Social Security checks are a bunch of criminals or something. No, in a standard Ponzi scheme, the people running it are the criminals, right? The people participating are dupes or victims, okay? And so here, it's extra not their fault because at least in a regular private sector Ponzi scheme like Bernie Madoff's victims, especially over time, they probably should have known better. But when it comes to Social Security, even though lots of us have known for a long time now that, yeah, this is unsustainable, we can't just opt out, right? So it's not that we fell for the confidence man's clever ploy and rhetorical techniques. It's no, the government said you are going to participate in this retirement scheme or else you will go to jail. Okay, so again, it's some people say somewhat cheekily that it's unfair to call Social Security a Ponzi scheme. It's unfair to Ponzi schemes because at least like the original, was it Charles Ponzi, he had to convince people to do it. Bernie Madoff wasn't sticking a gun in people's bellies and saying, give me your money, you're going to participate in this great scheme, aren't you? It'd be a shame if something were to happen to you and you didn't participate. No, they at least had to trick people into giving them their money, quote, voluntarily under false pretenses. All right. So again, that's the line that some people use. They do a similar thing you may have heard when people refer to Congress as whores or drunken sailors, and people like a PG or Rourke type will say, hey, that's not fair to whores and drunken sailors. Like, why are you impugning their good name by linking them to congressmen? Okay. So jocularity aside, this issue of a Ponzi scheme, What's interesting is, before I dive into why might one plausibly call it a Ponzi scheme, it's not merely right-wing, hard-nosed economists who want to slash and burn calling it that. There's actually Paul Samuelson, a giant of mainstream economics and a very, I don't know if left-wing is the right term, but certainly a fan of government intervention and a big fan of the Social Security program, the welfare state more broadly construed, and Paul Krugman. You may have heard of him. He also had a throwaway line one time when he was talking about Social Security and referred to it and said, or alluded to its Ponzi game aspect or something like that. Okay. And then critics dug that up years later when Republicans and Democrats were arguing about Social Security. So even Krugman admitted it was a Ponzi scheme, and then he had to hem and haw on, whoa, what I meant by that was, and what he meant was it's a Ponzi scheme, right? That's what it means. That's why people are saying that. So why are they saying that? Again, whether you're a fan of the program and think, hey, this is a neat little trick, or you're a critic and think, doesn't this demonstrate its unsustainability or its vulnerability to demographic shifts? What do they mean by that? Well, let's just first remind people of what the term means, like where it came from, right? So Ponzi, the original guy, what did he do? He had an ostensible investment, and so he goes around collecting money from investors, and he's just making up stuff, telling them what he's doing with it when he's not doing that. And then in a classic standard Ponzi scheme, how do you keep it going for a while and get a buzz going and to get more people to participate? Is the people who come in early think it's paying well. But what's happening is the guy running the Ponzi scheme takes in the money from the original investors, and then as he takes in money from like the next wave, he uses their investment to pay ostensible dividends on the original investors' money, right? So the original investors think everything is fine. That, yeah, I gave this guy a boatload of money, but he's giving me dividends periodically, and the rate of return is great. So yeah, I'm happy to keep my money parked with this guy in this venture, okay? And so long as you keep getting new investors coming in, you can keep up the facade, right? And depending on the specifics, to really make it work, you probably don't need to just keep the same number of investors, month after month, but it would have to grow actually, because the longer the thing continues, the more total capital is ostensibly invested. And so for the rate of return you've been promising people, you got to have that many more new people coming in to then have those checks go out the door to keep up the illusion. Okay. And then of course too, if at any moment somebody wants their money back, if you need to keep the illusion up, if they thought they had the right to withdraw their money, then of the incoming new people, you got to divert some of that cash just to pay off the principal of the earlier people. And so notice, in the early days, a Ponzi scheme can, quote, work. There can be investors, if they take their principal out, they might have made money on the thing and walked away and say, yeah, I got my original investment back, plus I made a nice rate of return. That was fine. All right, and the reason I'm stressing that is some people, to show, I think it was Elizabeth Warren, to allegedly demonstrate why Elon is wrong to call Social Security a Ponzi scheme, was saying Social Security hasn't missed a payment in 80 years. And so one thing is they had to adjust the rates, right? So it's not clear what does it mean to say it hasn't missed a payment. Under the original configuration, it didn't work. Ironically, in the Reagan administration, they really jacked up the, quote, worker contribution rate. All right, so it's not obvious what it would mean to just say it hasn't missed a payment, that okay, because they changed the rules midstream. But again, that doesn't mean, therefore, it's not a Ponzi scheme. All right, I won't go through all of it again right now. If you want to go review episode 77, which I'll link here in the show notes page, folks. So again, you're listening to episode 78 right now, but prior episode 77 of the InFi podcast, I walked through some of the major findings in the most recent trustee report for Social Security and the related disability, the old age insurance and disability program, OASDI. Okay, so they've known for decades that it was lobster, was underwater, right? That the present discounted value of the future worker contributions was less than the benefit payments given the current schedules and whatnot. And as of that snapshot last, I think it was May 2024, over a 75-year horizon, there was like a 29 point something trillion dollar discrepancy meaning the present value over the next 75 years of how much Social Security is going to owe recipients is $29 trillion and change higher than the present value of what all the workers over the next 75 years are going to kick into the system. Okay. So to just say those so far where they haven't missed a payment, so what? In the early days, Bernie Madoff's scheme hadn't missed a payment to investors either. That doesn't mean it wasn't a Ponzi scheme. Okay. So the basic problem with the way Social Security works is that it is what's called a pay-go approach. All right. So when they first instituted Social Security, it was one of the New Deal programs, they started giving benefit checks immediately to retired people and precious metals or something in real estate. No, it was spent immediately. It came in and went right out the door in the form of benefit checks to then beneficiaries, retired people and so forth, and those on disability or whatever. And so you say, well, how does that work? Well, because then when that batch of workers aged and then they retired, they just did the same thing to the next generation. So at that point, there was a new crop of babies had been born and then grew up and then got some skills and got into the workforce. And now they're being taxed, the so-called payroll contributions. By the way, just as an aside, the way these things are reckoned in the United States, at least, taxes taken out of worker paychecks to pay for Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, those are called payroll deductions. That's not part of the, quote, income tax. And so when you see a lot of times like right-wing conservative types will lament the fact that, only 47% of Americans even pay income tax and blah, blah. It might lead you to believe that there's a bunch of freeloaders out there that are getting off scot-free and Washington's not taking anything out of their paycheck. That's not correct. No, the government takes money out of everybody's paycheck. It's just some of that's not called the income tax, right? If it's going directly into the Social Security program, that's called payroll tax, all right? And it's not part of the income tax, because the income tax is to fund general government expenditures that they, in terms of the accounting, they keep Social Security and Medicare distinct from everything else, all right? They have their own dedicated tax. Okay. So anyway, the way the system has worked since it was established is that, again, the people who were already retired when it started, they were getting benefit checks even though they had never paid into it. And so then when the workers who supported them retired, it wasn't like there was a pile of corporate stocks that the government had accumulated on their behalf. No, their paychecks all along, their payroll contributions were spent. There were no savings. And so the only way to pay them was to repeat the process. And so now, by the time that first generation of workers grew up and retired, they had the second generation of workers in the workforce who were paying them and so on. So it just kept bootstrapping. All right. And so that's what's called a pay-go system. You pay as it goes. And so that can work. There's nothing, whether you think it's a good idea or not, or fair or what have you, that is sustainable so long as there aren't major demographic shifts, or so long as the population steadily grows. And so that more babies keep being born than old people die. And so that as the population grows over time, it starts out at the 0 to 1 category age group and then just keeps expanding, rippling through the system that way. That could be indefinitely sustainable, this pay-go system. But what screws things up is if you have a sudden bulge in the generations where there's a big bumper crop of babies, and then as that generation gets older, it has fewer kids and they're not all as concentrated. And so there's this big bulge moving through the system. And that's what's known as the baby boomers. And so that's partly what's happening, is that the birth rate has declined and people are living longer. All right. So it's a 1-2 punch. And so I don't have the statistics handy, but you can look at, like, when Social Security was first established, how many workers were there for every person receiving a benefit check? And it was a big number. And then if you checked in 1960 and checked, the number would have fallen. And then in 1980, it would have fallen. And then now it's much lower. And it's projected to go lower still, right? Well, I don't know if it's projected to go lower still, but now it's much lower than it was back in 1960. Okay. And so that's what's showing with this pay-go system with demographic shifts, because there's been no actual long-term saving, the worker contributions are just siphoned away and go out the door, then if the next crop of workers is smaller, you can either tighten the screws on them to pull more out of their paycheck, or you can cut the benefits to the old people. You got to do one of the two, or a combination. There's no other way to make it work. Okay. Now, having said that, and that's what Elon has in mind. And that's why he's suggesting the system's screwed up and, hey, we got to do something else. Okay. Now, some people, when they heard that, they rolled their eyes and said, okay, yeah, if you want to use that terminology, sure, Elon. But then guess what? Any system we use where old people are supported by young people, young workers, is going to be a Ponzi scheme, right? No matter what we do, unless we're just going to let old people die. Obviously, when you're 80 years old, if you're still eating, it's because there are young farmers who are now harvesting food that you end up eating, even though you didn't pick it yourself and you didn't do anything else either if you're retired. Right? So their claim is, to the extent that old people aren't just put out on a canoe and sent out into the ice the way the Eskimos allegedly did back in the day. I don't even know if that's true, but hey, I think we've all heard stories like that. Then come on, what are you talking about? And yeah, maybe there's some issues here with demographic shifts and we'll just have to deal with it. But we as a society are not just going to stand idly by and let the old people starve to death or die because they can't afford to have heat in the winter or something. Okay, so that's the claim. And I would say, no, that's wrong. If you have genuine saving and investment, then people's retirement is largely immune to demographic shifts. It's not the case that each generation of workers needs to have money siphoned out of their paycheck in order to support old people, but then, oh, don't worry, you're just paying it forward. And then we're going to take money out of the next generations of workers' paychecks to pay you. When you're old, that doesn't need to happen. All right. And if you're thinking it does, you're not understanding how the world works. All right. So specifically, if workers contribute money out of their paychecks and instead of it immediately being spent, if instead it goes into genuine investment, then that is building up a stockpile of assets that worker then, when he or she retires down the road, can draw upon. And so that worker's future retirement is not funded by skimming money out of the next generation of workers' paychecks. And so I used this on social media and a lot of people thought it was helpful. It can get subtle when you're worried about like thinking of stocks and bonds and stuff. So just for the simple point I'm making, to see the distinction, think of it in terms of physical goods. Okay. So you got a worker, he goes out and he produces 100 apples a day and he could consume all that stuff. And instead he takes a bunch of those and he trades them in the market for tools, like hammers and saws and screwdrivers and stuff like that. And then he just keeps doing that every pay period instead of consuming everything that he's earned with his labor power. He saves and invests some of it. And so he's got this growing stockpile of tools and equipment and he can, rent them out instead of just letting them sit there at his shed or something, right? Because he's accumulating a stockpile more than he personally needs, right? So he's just got all these hammers. And so like the local carpenters or the people who want to become carpenters and they need tools, they go to him because he's got the stockpile. He rents it out to them. Okay. And so that's what he does. And then you say, well, what does he do with the income he gets from renting it? He goes and buys more tools, right? Because that's the point. He's living below his means, right? He's not just going to eat more. Okay. So he's over time just accumulating this stockpile. And then after a while, as the stockpile gets bigger, he trades into bigger things. Like, and once he gets 100 hammers, instead of getting the 101st hammer, now he rolls that over and he trades that for a tractor. Okay. So now he's got a tractor. Then over time, he's got 2 tractors and and he just keeps doing that. Then after a while, he owns an 18-wheeler that he rents out to truckers. Okay, so he's got this ever-expanding stockpile of this inventory of just physical, what economists would call capital goods. Just think of tools and equipment. Okay, stuff that's not directly useful. It's not that he's stockpiling canned tuna fish that you could eat in an emergency. No, he's stockpiling things that make workers more physically productive. Okay, and so then when he's 65 and he's retired, he now has this huge stockpile of all kinds of tools and equipment, including like heavy machinery. And then you say, oh, so I guess now he's going to starve to death, right? Because he's not using his bare hands to go out and earn wages, selling his labor hours. No. Now he relies on this huge stockpile of tools and equipment and heavy machinery that he's accumulated over the decades of his working career. All right. So he goes out, and at that point, there's apprentices working for carpenters and stuff that need tools. And people say, oh yeah, go to that guy down the street. He's got a whole shed full of tools. You can rent out from that guy. Okay. And so that's how the guy, after he's officially retired, can still have people giving him apples and stuff, is because now those apprentices give him some of their apples in exchange for being able to use his hammer all week or whatever. All right. So that's how he can still eat when he's retired. And you can say, okay, yeah, but still, even with your contrived example, Murphy, still a basic point, right? That he's skimming off of the food that's being produced by the young people at that point. Say, I mean, depending on how you want to classify, but it's not skimming off, right? It's not that those workers on their own generated a bunch of apples and then said, oh, here you go, because we don't want you to starve. No. With their bare hands, they could only generate a certain amount. And then this guy's got a bunch of ladders and baskets that he's accumulated over the years. And he says, here's some ladders and baskets. Here's a pole that I've saved up over time. And now those workers go out and they can harvest more apples per hour because they're using that guy's tools. So no, the workers, yes, there's a sense in which out of the harvest, they give some of the apples to the old guy now, but the harvest is bigger because those young workers are using the tools that guy has built up over the decades. Okay, so the workers end up with more apples than they would have had if this guy never saved anything. All right, so again, yes, there is a transfer in terms of physical location of apples harvested in one place and then handed over to some guy who's sitting in his house watching Netflix or something, watching old Perry Mason reruns. But it's not the same thing as what happens in a different framework, right? So if you picture what I just explained there, and now instead imagine a different kind of system where every pay period, that same guy now, he doesn't eat all the apples that he himself has harvested. He saves 10% of them, but he doesn't go out and trade them for screwdrivers and hammers and stuff and then just start accumulating a stockpile of physical tools and equipment. No, instead, he just gives them to old people and they eat the apples. There is no stockpile of screwdrivers and hammers that's being accumulated anywhere in the system. But the government officials at that time say to at that point, the young worker whose apples are being taken to go feed the old people, they say, oh, don't worry. Dear, here's a piece of paper from us saying 30 years from now, when you retire, the government officials at that time promise we're going to do this same thing to the next generation of workers. And they're going to give you apples out of what they pick. Okay, so you see the fundamental difference there? The workers in that second scenario in the future are not going to be able to harvest more apples because now they're working with more tools and equipment. No, because nobody actually saved or invested, I should say. Like the one guy saved, but then the other people consumed it right away when it's just diverted to the existing retirees. Okay, so again, it's a critical difference. And so that's why when you see these calculations, you may remember, I'll link to this, folks, too. I forget which episode number it is off the top of my head, but recently I had Tyler Watts on, and he gave his proposal for privatizing Social Security. So what drives those types of examples, those demonstrations where people show, look at how much better you would be if instead of effectively being forced to lend your Social Security payroll contributions into the SSA and then getting your benefit checks decades in a row, if you could just invest it yourself in a diversified portfolio, you'd have way more at retirement time. And I'm saying the reason that is true is because when you're investing it yourself, it's actually gestating over time. That is actually saved and invested. Whereas in the Social Security system, that's not what happens. It's gone. There is no net saving. One party saves and the other party dissaves. Okay, society as a whole is not accumulating more assets. And again, that's why I was speaking earlier in physical terms, just so you can understand this isn't just a matter of accounting and bookkeeping. This refers to real physical things. That if the workers are producing stuff and they live below their means, they consume less than their income, you can actually point to stuff on a societal scale as an economist to show what that looks like, that the economy pivots away from just making consumer-oriented goods and services, and it shifts into making what economists call capital goods, stuff like tools and equipment, machinery. And so that stuff makes the workers down the road more productive. And that's how the standard of living can rise over time, even if technology is held constant. Okay, so it's a critical distinction. And then the last point, just to drive it home, is notice if each worker, in a sense, is providing for his or her own retirement through saving and investment, then demographic shifts don't matter that much. So yeah, if you turn 65 and then there are literally no workers left, that's going to be a problem. Even if you have a bunch of tools and tractors and stuff, if there's literally no farmers, then the tractor's going to be useless. But you can see you're much less dependent on the vagaries of the next generation's birth rate and things like that when you've accumulated a stockpile of physical assets that you can lend out to people, right? So it's like a longitudinal retirement plan, if you're familiar with that terminology, all right, where each worker, in a sense, builds up the stockpile that then he or she draws upon in retirement. Okay, now let us switch gears and talk about Elon's tweet regarding GDP. So we'll flash that up on the screen. So you can see Elon was retweeting. So this happened on February 28th. Elon was retweeting a tweet from Geiger Capital where the guy said, "Holy excrement." He didn't say excrement. "Atlanta Fed is now projecting that quarter one GDP will be negative 1.5%, ... a contraction. Last week, it was 2.3, positive 2.3%. Okay. So they're saying that the Atlanta Fed, in the course of a week, as of when this tweet came out on February 28th, had updated its forecast for what U.S. GDP growth was going to be in the first quarter of 2025. And it went from thinking it was going to be an expansion of 2.3% to a contraction of 1.5%. Okay. And so what the heck could have changed in a week? Oh, all the Doge stuff coming out and all the planned spending cuts. Now, instantly, I didn't jump into the Atlanta Fed's, it's called GDP Now. That's the Atlanta Fed's like computer simulation package or whatever that generates these estimates. There could have been stuff in there about like, oh, Trump's threatening tariffs and there could be a trade war. So I'm not saying this is purely because of spending cuts, but Elon clearly is taking that route. And then regardless of whether that is why the Atlanta Fed said what it said, I want to just take Elon's claim on its own. And then because like I said, people were challenging it. So then Elon says regarding this, a more accurate measure of GDP would exclude government spending. Otherwise, you can scale GDP artificially high by spending money on things that don't make people's lives better. For example, you could shift everyone who is building cars to working at the DMV. That would result in no cars and a much worse standard of living, but GDP would appear to be the same. All right. So in order to, let me just back up. So you understand where he's coming from. All right. So to make sure we know the basics here, GDP, stands for gross domestic product, is supposed to be measuring how much in new goods and services are produced within a country's borders in a given time period, whether it's a quarter or a year. Okay. The way it is often measured, even though it is ostensibly measuring output, production, usually they measure it by spending, because if something is produced and then sold for money, that same transaction, if you were adding up all the money amounts of production, that's the same thing as adding up all the money amounts spent on purchases, because it's the same transaction, just looked at it from a different angle. So we have better data on expenditures than we do on production. And so that's why in practice, even though technically what we're trying to do is measure production, economists often go through and they have all sorts of data sources to estimate, okay, well, in the United States this quarter, how much was spent on private sector consumption on newly produced goods and services? Like, so if you go spend $5,000 buying a used car, that shouldn't be in GDP, right? Because the car was already made in a prior period. When the car was made as a new car and somebody bought it, that purchase price went into that period's GDP. So you wouldn't want to count it again. Okay. So again, it's not total spending. It's, if they do it correctly, it's supposed to be spending on newly produced goods and services, right? And that's why inventory adjustments come into play. Okay. So the spending includes when the government spends money buying goods and services. All right. So I want to be clear, it doesn't include transfer payments. All right. Because the idea is there, like if the government is sending a Social Security recipient what they're owed that month as a benefit check, that doesn't go into GDP, because the idea is the government is not buying somebody's service as being a retiree. That's just a transfer. Okay. However, if the government spends $1 billion buying a bunch of tanks, then that does go into GDP. And so Elon's point now is to say there's something screwy about that, because the government can spend money on things that don't obviously raise the standard of living. The way if a private household spends $30,000 buying a new car, presumably they did it because they valued that car at least at more than the $30,000 that they gave up to get it. So there's a plausible sense in which that car is worth $30,000. And so if it's a newly produced car and you want to say, oh, the fact that that factory made that car and that was added to the world now, how should we evaluate that? Or, how much credit should we give to the U.S. economy? Assume it was made domestically. How do we put it on an even footing and have a common denominator with all the other things that were made? Well, you got to use dollar terms, right? Otherwise, how could you compare cars with computers and movie theater showings and stuff like that? And meals at fancy restaurants, the only way to put those all in a common footing, common denominator, is to use money terms. Okay. So a household spends $30,000 buying a new car. That's prima facie evidence that GDP was $30,000 that year because of that new car that was produced. What else would you say? But Elon's point that I agree with is if the government spends $30,000 buying some equipment for people in the military, it's not obvious that that should be counted the same as the, quote, same amount of total production as the $30,000 car that was sold in the private sector. And the reason is that the incentives are different, right? So I'm elaborating here to explain why this is the case, whereas, Elon didn't get into that in his tweet. But the incentives facing the decision makers, the government officials who authorize that type of spending, those incentives are different, right? So with the household, the reason they wouldn't spend $30,000 buying just a 10-speed bicycle and say, oh, well, we need to use something to get to work, is because that clearly wouldn't be worth it. And so that's why nobody's doing that. And that's why we don't need to worry about, oh, well, what if somebody actually spent $30,000 buying a bicycle, but really a bicycle's not worth $30,000, right? We shouldn't count that. It's because nobody's doing that. However, there are plenty of government officials who are spending ludicrous amounts of money on things that, quote, aren't worth that. And again, the reason is because it's not their money. If they save it, right? Like a private corporation, there could be examples of overspending and stuff, but the corporation has the incentive. Ultimately, the shareholders would want to set up procedures by which the corporation monitors its spending. If they catch conflicts of interest, like, oh, some of our purchasing agents are getting wined and dined by the vendors and they're giving them tickets to baseball games. And so we got to watch out for that because we don't want our buyers to be, have a conflict of interest. Okay, right, that kind of stuff. So those things do happen outside of government. But the point is, outside of government, because it's people's own money on the line, and if they save it, they can keep it. That's why there are incentives in place to try to root that stuff out. So that prima facie, when some entity in the private sector spends $30,000 on something, economists can say, yeah, that's a good reason to say that's $30,000 worth of output. Whereas in the government sector, there's nothing analogous to that. Okay? So there's lots we could say about this, but let me just, in the interest of brevity, focus on one particular claim. People pushed back against Elon here by showing, there's actually a community notes right in this example. Well, okay, I'll go ahead and just read this community note, but this wasn't exactly what I was getting at. So it says, the United States already reports a measure of GDP excluding government spending called value added by private industries. It currently accounts for 88.7% of U.S. GDP and has steadily risen as a share of GDP since 2009 under both Obama and Biden as well as Trump. Okay. The pushback that I saw, though, that I want to focus on was I saw some guys using the Fred graphs, the St. Louis Fed's nice charting tools, showing they plotted just total GDP, which includes government consumption and investment expenditures, with just private sector GDP. And they show that those two lines move hand in glove in the post-war period, which is when the Fred data sets kick in, like in 1947. And then some guy even ran the correlation coefficient, and it's very close to 1, right? So their point is Elon's making this theoretical mountain out of a molehill here, where in practice, conventional GDP, which includes government spending, and private sector GDP are basically the same thing. They move the same way statistically. And so the implication being, if the Atlanta Fed now is predicting a recession because Doge is cutting spending, you can't just wave your hands and make that disappear, Elon. No, that's actually showing that government spending is an important part of the economy. And there's going to be, quote, a real recession, right? That's the gist of what I was seeing. And so in response, and I'll just walk you guys through this counterexample I gave, and we can wrap up. I said, it's ironic that this one guy in particular that responded to Elon that way by posting a chart started in 1947. I said, it's ironic that was the starting point. And to be clear, the guy wasn't being dishonest, that if you want to use quarterly data, it starts in 1947. There's lots of data sets that go back to right after World War II, partly because all sorts of government agencies and data collection greatly expanded or were created outright during the Second World War, and then they didn't go away. And so that's why we have all this data collection up and running, and that typically a lot of these economic data sets, again, start right after World War II. All right. So I said it's ironic that that's where he started the analysis, because the best counterexample to what he's trying to show there happened right at the end of World War II. And then I realized I can show it with Fred data. It's just you got to use annual, right? So in the Fred database, the quarterly GDP data starts in 1947. But if you just want the annual figures, it goes back to 1929. Okay. And so that's now what we're looking at here. All right. So this diagram is showing total GDP, which includes the government component, and that's the blue line, right? So it's higher. It's always on top. And then the green line is just the private sector component of it. So specifically, the green line is gross private domestic investment plus personal consumption expenditures plus net exports of goods and services, right? So to those elements, if you're familiar with the GDP formula, it's usually written as C plus I plus G plus net exports. Okay, and the G stands for government spending. But again, I want to be clear, strictly speaking, it's not the federal government's budget, because a lot of that is transfer payments. It's, to do it correctly, it is what is the government spending on both consumption and investment. Okay, so investment, things like, building bridges or something that are government owned would be part of that. All right, so you can see just on this chart, and so it starts at 1929 and I ended at 1949. And again, these are just annual, right? So they're just each year they have the data point, and then it's just connecting the lines to make it look smooth. And in these Fred charts, the gray shaded regions are recessions, or in our case, in the beginning here, they're the Great Depression. Okay, so you can see typically these lines move in a very similar fashion that you can see. And if you're looking at the left of the chart there, they both collapse from around 100 in 1929, basically getting cut in half down to, in the 50s. And that's billions of dollars, by the way. And this is all now. This is not inflation adjusted. I should be clear. Down to the early 30s there, getting basically cut in half over that period. And then they bottom out in 33, start rising up. And then there was, if you're familiar with the 30s, there was a double dip in 37, 38. Okay. And that's where that second thing is. So you can see the blue line and the green line pretty much move in tandem. The blue line's always a little bit higher, but that's because the government was always spending. All right. And then you see going into World War II, right? So in 1941, You may remember there was an infamous event that happened, and you see all of a sudden, for the first time, there's this humongous disparity now in these two lines. The blue line accelerates upward, whereas the green line flatlines, and then only eventually starts curving up again. All right. And so what's happening there in 1942, 1943 is the government is massively expanding its total spending to fund the war effort. And so what's happening in real terms is steel and worker hours and rubber and glass and so on are all being diverted away from private sector uses, right? They're not making very many automobiles for civilian use. Everything's getting diverted to the factories to be cranking out tanks and armored vehicles and battleships and, bullets and stuff. So that's why those charts look like that. And then what's most interesting for our purposes, you can see what happens from 1945 to 1946. You see that blue line is basically flat, and they called it a recession. See that last gray, but there's one that's just at the far right of the screen that I'm showing you here, but right before the 1946 line there. Okay, so again, these are annual figures, and so that gray region there is actually showing what happened going from 45 into 46. All right, and you can see even though the blue line is flat, that green line spikes. And then after that, they start moving again in lockstep. But notice there's a much bigger gap now after the war between the blue line and the green line than there was before the war. All right, so what's happened here is during World War II, the government siphoned a huge amount of resources out of the private sector into the military. Then there was a demobilization right at the end of the war, 45, going into 46. And a lot of that material got redirected back to the private sector. But then after that readjustment going forward, the government was permanently a bigger share of the economy than it had been before the war. Okay. But to Elon's point here, you can see what's happening in that post-war demobilization. The blue line actually, you can't see it, you eyeball it, but it actually shrank a little bit. So specifically in 1945, total GDP, the blue line was 228 billion. And then a year later, in 1946, it had dropped slightly. So it was 228.0. And then a year later, it had dropped to 227.5 for a 0.2% drop. And that's why it was a recession. Nominal GDP was actually lower in 1946 than it had been in 1945. It looked like the economy slightly shrank. And that's why they called it a recession. And yet, if you looked at how many radios were being produced and nylon stockings for women and cars for civilian use, that all exploded upward. Specifically, private sector GDP in 1945 was 131.6 billion. In a year later, it was 184.5 billion, a 40% increase. In terms of U.S. history, I believe that's the biggest jump. I don't think there was something comparable. I mean, the only time it could have been would be the Civil War. For one thing, our data's not good back then, but also I don't think you had this crisp of a expansion of the federal footprint in the economy and then a rapid pullback the way you had here. Okay. But for sure, putting the Civil War aside, let's say clearly this is the biggest jump in private sector production in 1 year in U.S. history. And then I don't have it here, but in terms of the individual components, the gross private domestic investment, that thing jumped like 167%, something like that in 1 year, in this 1 year period, right? So it's not just private consumption that rose. The thing that really went through the roof was private investment in this year, which again, all makes sense a la Elon Musk's framework. All right. What's difficult is for the critics of Elon who are trying to say, oh, come on, he's making this big disparity or distinction between the government doing stuff versus the private sector. So here, how do they explain this? All right. Now, to be fair, they can say, well, yeah, they had to fight the Nazis. Shit, give me a break. Right. But the point is, that's not quantifiable. Okay. That had the government been spending this money to build all these tanks or whatever to then go drive them into the ocean, the numbers would look the same. Okay. There's no feedback. It's not like we're getting paid bounties to go get the Japanese Imperial Navy or something, and that we're getting paid as mark and reprisal or something. Okay. So that's my response to Elon's critics, that according to what they're saying, I don't know, these things generally track or whatever. This is a huge counterexample. And I think they would be hard pressed. And by the way, there were plenty of mainstream Keynesians near the end of World War II who were warning that, hey, it was the wartime spending that pulled us out of the Great Depression. If we just turn the dial and cut back on government spending too rapidly, we're going to get plunged right back into the Great Depression. There were plenty of them warning that, and they were totally wrong. Okay? Because there's a multiplier effect and whatever. And so now if the factory owners who are cranking out takes, all of a sudden, if their contracts get pulled, well, then now they can't pay their workers, and then they can't go out to eat, and just spiraling waves of, quote, saving that just ripples through the economy and causes a depression because you idiot free marketeers think the economy is just like a household. And right. So there's that kind of mentality. And you can see that was totally wrong. All right. And then the last point I'll make here is once you see this counterexample and you just play around with that and you think back to what the critics had been saying, that on their own terms, they thought they were blowing up Elon Musk when he was saying that, no, we shouldn't include government spending as part of GDP, because if just by definition, when the government spends money, that's going to boost GDP, well, then there's no reason to suppose that's going to be contributing to the welfare the way that private sector spending is. And so, he was coming up with a scenario where they take money out of the private sector and go do something like have more employees at the DMV that colloquially people don't appreciate. Or you could do another thing like, oh, what if you pay one group of workers to dig holes and pay another group of workers to fill them up? That's another popular refrain in this type of discussion. Yep. If they are actually hired by the government to do that, that would contribute towards GDP. They would be for the service of whole production and whole destruction. That's what we'd be paying them for. And that would get counted as part of GDP. And Elon's point is that's not really the same thing though, right? Economically, is the private sector paying workers to dig holes to then lay the foundation for a house. Okay. Or if there's like a demolition team, they got to get rid of a building or something. They take it out and they fill that hole up and put something else there. That could work too, right? So it's not that digging holes and filling holes is intrinsically useless, but it depends on the context, right? So I'm just trying to make the point there that that's what Elon was saying. And then the critics thought that by showing a chart of over time, the time series of total GDP versus private sector GDP, and they tended to move together, that was somehow blowing up his point. And I would say, no, why would it? If all along, every period, the government took a certain amount from the private sector in order to spend it on relatively useless government, quote, services, yeah, those two numbers would move in tandem. So there's no the critics think that that's showing, you're wrong, Elon. Well, no, that is entirely consistent with what his point was, that data. All right. And so then if you're trying to understand, well, what contribution am I making by pointing this World War II episode? It's because to really see it, you need a really large exogenous change in the government spending to then see what impact does that have. Okay, so in Elon's example, he was trying to show what if there was a change and all of a sudden they sucked more out of the private sector in order to expand the DMV, and then what effect would that have? Okay, and so that's what I'm saying. But just over time, the fact that those two series move hand in hand, that doesn't mean anything. That's what it would look like if Elon were right. So to be fair to the critics, that's what it would look like if he were wrong too. My point is just showing those long-term charts doesn't really do anything one way or the other. Where you do really see it is an example like I'm showing, where if there's a massive change in government spending, and in particular, not because of the economy, right? So that you wouldn't want, the thing that can kind of screw some of this stuff up is, if the economy tanks, and then that means there's less money for the government, and then what happens to government spending, right? So there's things like that where if the economy moves independently, then that can cause issues, and it's hard you confuse causation with correlation. But I'm saying, so really for a clean measure of the kind of thing Elon Musk has in mind here, you would like to see a case where the government either massively expanded or massively cut government spending, not because of the underlying change in private GDP, right? So it's not like, there was a boom, and so the government could afford to spend more, or there was a massive crash, and so the government had to cut its budget. because we were on the gold standard, right? So that's what I'm saying. That's why World War II is such a perfect example where the government did not crank up military spending in 1941 is a way to get out of the Depression. That's not what happened. And the government did not turn down the military spending in 1945 because the economy had collapsed. That wasn't what happened, right? And so that's why this is a pretty clear-cut case. And as you can see, it's exactly what it would look like if Elon's worldview were correct. But it's not what the world would necessarily look like. Certainly, the post-war demobilization, like I say, there were plenty of Keynesians warning if we cut the government spending too fast, we're going to go right back into the Great Depression. And that's not what happened. You might say, oh, wasn't there a recession? Yeah, that they market like that because a recession is defined as a fall in GDP. Okay, but if you were in the US at the time, would it look like everybody was, oh, we're back in the Depression? No. Like I said, private sector output rose 40%. Private sector investment spending rose 167% in 1 year. Okay, so no, business was booming. People were getting all sorts of consumer goods and services that they had been unable to get because of wartime rationing. So no, they felt great. The economy was awesome as far as American consumers were concerned in this period, even though technically it was labeled a recession. So that's just, again, underscoring Elon's point. It's crazy to label that a recession when no, that was a huge jump in the standard of living. Again, you can say, oh, it was necessary to go fight the Nazis or whatever, but that doesn't redound to the material welfare of the American people the same way that spending more on nylon stockings and radios did. Okay, you can say it was a necessary evil, but that certainly made us materially poorer to have to go do that. It would have been better if there was no reason to go fight the war. That would have been better still in terms of the material standard of living of not just Americans, but everybody. Okay, well, I've made my point, I hope. Hopefully you folks now understand the issues of the Social Security system and whether it's a Ponzi scheme or not, and how GDP is calculated and the relationship between government expenditures and private expenditures. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. See you next time.